The first time smoke poured from both chimneys at once. They laughed so hard one man nearly dropped his rifle in the snow. They said no widow had need for one fireplace, let alone two. Said she must be trying to dry laundry in the roof beams, or had gone mad from grief. Said it'd never work. Heat'd all float out the top. Waste of stone, waste of firewood, waste of her dead husband's cabin. But the snow came thicker than anyone guessed that year, and the widow, well, she didn't argue. She just kept the fire burning. Her name was Ruth Wexley, and she hadn't planned on staying. The cabin had belonged to her husband's older brother, who'd died with a mining claim under snow so deep no one ever found the body. Her husband, Silas, had inherited it just in time to die himself, fever, fast and mean, 2 days after arriving. That had been late fall. By December, Ruth was alone in the hills, 3 miles from the nearest soul, with nothing but a loaded rifle, a sled of firewood, and the oddest cabin the county had ever seen. It wasn't her idea, the double fireplace. When they'd arrived, the cabin had been nothing but a shell. 3 walls still held, the rest was scorched. Fire had gutted the interior in the spring. Chimney collapse, some guessed. They were just trying to rebuild fast enough to stay ahead of the cold. Ruth had helped lift stones because she didn't know what else to do. She hadn't cried much, hadn't spoken either, just kept working, dragging timber, setting beams. But Silas, he was the one who'd insisted on building it this way. "We'll put in 2 hearths," he'd said, drawing a sketch with charcoal on the half-burnt floorboard. "One here on the south wall, the other dead opposite on the north. Same chimney stack. Split it up the middle with stone. Draft'll pull clean. Heat will stay." She'd blinked at him. "Aren't most hearths set in the middle?" "Aye, but not for cabins like this," he said. "The snow'll drift up 10 feet along one wall. Cold'll seep straight through it. 2 fires pushing heat toward the center'll keep every plank warm." She hadn't argued. She hadn't believed him either. And then he was gone, and the sketch was still there. By the time the men from the low valley rode up to check on her in January, she had already stacked her own rock, mortared her own gaps, and laid the flues herself. She had sealed every crack, packed clay around the double-stack chimney, where it poked through the pitched roof, and split enough wood to keep it all roaring. The first chimney sent its smoke east, the second west, each with its own little puff of black like antlers in the frost. And when she opened the cabin door, warm air burst out in a rush so strong one of the riders stumbled backward. They could hardly believe it. Still, they mocked her when they left. 2 fires, 2 mouths to feed, one muttered, tugging his horse down the slope. No woman keeps that pace alone. But Ruth wasn't burning 2 fires. That was the trick. She was burning one. The chimney Silas designed wasn't just split. It was built to share. One fire, set in a stone heart at the center of the cabin, could vent through either side. Dampers, hand-shaped from old iron, let her pull smoke whichever direction she chose. When wind hit from the north, she let it pull the draft south, keeping warm air trapped low. When it flipped, as she reversed it, the heat stayed, the smoke left. It was silent, steady, and stubborn as Ruth herself. The townspeople didn't understand, but they didn't need to. She had no plans to come down the mountain until the child came. He arrived just after the ice storm, February, when even the sky seemed frozen solid. She heard the knock before she saw him, weak, slow, a scraping more than anything. She gripped her rifle with one hand and the poker with the other, and opened the door only a crack. He couldn't have been more than 6, barefoot, wrapped in what looked like a ripped wool blanket, lips purple, hands stiff. He didn't speak. She didn't either. She just reached out, hooked her arm under his shoulder, and pulled. Inside the cabin, he collapsed. The heat hit him like a wave. His eyes rolled back. His fingers began to twitch. And she knew what that meant. The blood was coming back, and it would hurt. She bundled him fast, sat him close to the fire, rubbed his hands with old oil she kept in a cracked jar. He never said his name, didn't say anything for 2 days. And when he did, all he said was, "My sister." That was when Ruth knew it wasn't over. She left at dawn the next morning, roped the sled behind her, and followed his tiny footprints back through the snow, fading fast, but still visible. The wind cut like a knife. She wore everything she owned, wool skirt, 2 coats, scarf over her mouth. The boy had pointed east when she asked. "Creek," he whispered. "Downhill, under tree." She found the girl under a pine, half covered in snow, alive, barely. Her legs were stiff and one eye wouldn't open. Ruth didn't waste a second. She wrapped her like a log, tied her to the sled, and pulled. It took nearly 4 hours to get back, but when she opened the door to her cabin, both fireplaces still smoked, and the heat wrapped the girl like a blanket. They'd survive. Ruth would make sure of it, and that, she thought, should have been the end of it. But nothing was ever that simple on the mountain, because 3 nights later, she heard another knock, and this time it wasn't a child. Ruth froze at the sound, not from fear, not yet, but from that deep, bone-rooted instinct mountain folk carry, the certainty that a knock at your door in the middle of a storm is either a soul in need or something worse. The girl and boy were asleep in the loft, curled under patched quilts beside a tin pan of boiled water. The girl had coughed all day, deep, ragged, tearing, and Ruth had just coaxed her to rest with warm broth and an old trick involving spruce sap and bear grease rubbed on her chest. She'd planned to sit up another hour, just to be sure the fever didn't break again, but the knock came instead. 3 slow taps, then silence. She crossed the floor in her socks, rifle in hand. The fire crackled, steady, and the chimney purred like a cat in a sunbeam. The sound of a perfectly working drawer. Outside, the storm had quieted, but the snow hadn't stopped. It came down like powdered ash, fine as flour, burying every track within minutes. She opened the door 2 inches and braced herself. A man stood there, not old, not young, mid-30s maybe. His face was ruddy from the cold, beard thick with frost, and his coat looked military, or had once been. Blue wool, fringed with leather, torn at the seams. He didn't speak, just nodded, eyes sunken and hollow. Behind him, nothing but dark pines and white wind. "You're alone?" Ruth asked. He nodded once. "You armed?" He didn't move. "Answer me," she said louder. He held up both hands, slow and deliberate. No gloves, fingers red and raw. "Got jumped," he rasped. "They took everything." "Who did?" "Didn't see. Just heard him." She studied him. His breath fogged weakly. He was near freezing, not faking that part. "You'll leave your boots outside," she said at last. "And your coat. Don't bring snow in." He nodded, silent, and began unlacing with stiff fingers. She let him in, watched him carefully as he stepped past, shoulders hunched. He looked around once, took in the heat, the dual fireplaces, the children above. "You're alone?" he asked. Ruth didn't answer. She slid the bolt into place behind him. The man didn't speak again that night. She gave him a wool blanket and a place near the fire, and he sat like a statue, hands curled around the heat of an empty tin cup. His eyes flicked often toward the chimneys, as if trying to understand them. The next morning, he was still there, still quiet. The boy stirred, came down the ladder, and froze when he saw the stranger. But Ruth gave him a look, calm, flat, and the boy seemed to settle. The girl woke last. Her fever had broken. Her first words that morning weren't words at all, but a scream when she saw the man. He didn't move. Ruth pulled her close. "Shh, he's not here to harm us. Just passing through." The man looked away, guilt or pain on his face. Hard to tell which. Later that day, while he stepped outside to relieve himself, the boy whispered to Ruth, "He was one of them." "One of who?" "The ones who took our cabin." She stared at him. "Are you sure?" The boy nodded. "I remember his coat. Blue with a rip. One of the ones who laughed." She thought back. Late autumn, when she was stacking stone alone, a pair of riders had passed by and jeered from the ridge. "You building a chimney for each shoe?" one had shouted. "Might as well put a stove in the outhouse while you're at it." Ruth hadn't looked up. That had been before the snow, before her husband's name stopped getting mentioned in town, before the children showed up half dead in the woods. She sat with that knowledge all afternoon. Didn't speak it, didn't ask. That night she left the man near the fire again, fed him, watched him eat slow and grateful, like he hadn't had a hot meal in weeks. She waited until he nodded off, head slumped on his chest, breath steady. Then she opened the trapdoor in the floor. The space below the cabin was hardly more than a crawl hole, dirt-packed, barely 4 feet deep, with timbers set like ribs to keep the weight of the hearth above from caving in. But she'd dug a channel, months ago, wide enough for one person to crawl through, and sealed it with bark and stone, an escape tunnel, if it ever came to that. She lit a stub of candle, crawled inside, and checked what she kept there. 2 rifles, 4 jars of salted pork, and a pair of heavy boots wrapped in canvas. She left the candle burning, returned to the fire. The man was awake. "You always dig under your fire?" he asked softly. She didn't flinch. You were awake. I heard you lift the hatch. Then I suppose you know I keep a second rifle." He nodded. "I'd have done the same." Silence again. Then he said, "I'm not proud of what happened. Was it your bullet that killed their father?" "No." "Was it your hands that lit their barn?" "No." "But you were there?" "Yes." The fire cracked. Ruth stirred the coals, moved the kettle. The chimney sent its smoke north now, as the wind had shifted again. "You ran," she said. "That's why you're here." "They turned on me," he said. "Took my things. Left me with nothing." "Because you tried to stop them? Because I didn't do enough to help?" He looked up. "You're right to hate me." She didn't respond, didn't confirm it, didn't deny it. He said nothing more. That night he slept by the hearth again, and in the morning he was gone, left no note. Took no food, just vanished. Only his footprints told the story, heading east, toward the bluff where the old mining road had once run. Ruth said nothing of it to the children. They didn't ask. The snow thickened. February dragged into March. And that was when the second man came. This one didn't knock. He kicked the door in. The door crashed open like it had been kicked by a mule. Snow flew in on a gust of wind so hard it snuffed the flame on Ruth's lamp and sent a dozen loose papers off her table. The girls screamed from the loft above. Ruth was already moving, rifle in hand, no time to think, no time to speak. The fire cast long shadows and lit the figure in the doorway like some monster from a bad dream. He stepped inside without hesitation, tall, broad, and wearing a coat she recognized instantly. Not from before, not from town, but from a nightmare she'd buried. Dark grey, patched with old blood, a small round patch on the shoulder, like a faded military brand that meant nothing anymore. He ducked under the lintel with the arrogance of a man who had never once asked permission to enter any place. The girl whimpered again. The boy was already at the ladder, trying to pull her back. Ruth planted herself between them and the man. Her rifle stayed level. She didn't tremble. "You're Ruth Wexley," the man said. His voice was smooth, dry, like old leather. "Saw your fire from the ridge. Thought I might pay a call." "You picked a bad night," she said coldly. "And a worse tone?" "Did I?" he asked. "'Cause from what I heard, you've got a miracle stove in here, double fireplace and one fire. That's the talk down valley. Some say you're burning coal. Or some say you've got a trap door to hell." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "I don't care which it is. I'm cold. I want in." "You already are in," Ruth said. He laughed, took another step, then two. Ruth fired. The shot slammed into the floorboards a half-inch from his boot. "You're warm now," she said. "Step again, and I'll put the next one higher." The man didn't blink, didn't step. He just studied her like a cat studies a hawk, wary but unbothered. Then he turned slowly and kicked the door closed behind him. Wind moaned. The fire snapped. "I know who you are," he said after a moment. "Widow of Silas Wexley, no children. No land deed, no kin to speak of. Only reason anyone let you stay this long is 'cause you're half ghost already. They figured the cold would finish what grief started." Ruth said nothing. "But then you kept living. And people started talking. First, just the women, then the men, about how warm your cabin is, how quiet, how strong. Some wondered how a woman alone could do it. Others," he stepped closer, "wondered what kind of help you must have." She could smell him now. Wood smoke, sweat, sour whiskey. She kept the rifle leveled at his chest. "You came here to rob me?" she asked flatly. He shook his head. "I came here to learn. You're standing in it, nothing to see." "Oh, I disagree," he said. "This place, it's different. Can feel it in my teeth." He walked to the central hearth and knelt beside it, ignoring the weapon aimed at him. He touched the stone, slowly, reverently. "Warm as midsummer," he murmured. "One fire feeding two chimneys. That's not simple luck. That's design." She said nothing. "Who built it?" he asked. "I did." He looked up, my eyes flickering in the firelight. "You?" he asked. "All this?" "I had help," she admitted. "But the man's gone now." The stranger nodded. "What's underneath?" "Rock, dirt, clay." He reached toward the trapdoor. She cocked the rifle louder. "Don't," she warned. He paused, smiled again. "You don't trust me." "You're right." He stood, brushing off his knees. "That's smart, but it's also a shame. I could help you, you know. Spread the word. Get this design patented. You could make something from it. Money, name, power. Town bend over backward if you told 'em how to keep warm without burning through their woodshed." "I don't need anything from town," she said. He tilted his head. "Don't you?" He looked up toward the loft where the children had gone silent. "They're not yours. I heard that too, that they wandered up here near dead." "Ah, and you took them in. Noble, some say. Stupid, others." He smiled again. "Personally, I think it was weak. The second you let someone rely on you, you're not free anymore." "You done talking?" Ruth asked. The man stared at her. Then he moved fast. Faster than she thought possible for someone that broad. He grabbed the poker from beside the hearth and swung. She ducked, rifle still up, and smashed the stock into his shoulder. He grunted, stumbled, and dropped the iron. She stepped back, leveled the barrel, but he lunged. She fired again. The shot tore through his side, and he screamed, loud, high, animal-like. Blood sprayed the stones. He fell to one knee, gasping. Then, unbelievably, he lunged again. She had no time to reload, dropped the rifle, grabbed the pan of boiling water from the stove, and flung it full into his face. He screamed louder. He collapsed onto the floorboards, writhing, clawing at his eyes. She kicked the poker across the room, retrieved her rifle, and pointed it down at him, hand steady as steel. "I told you," she said. "You're warm now." But the door had flown wide in the chaos, and snow poured in, and through it, movement, another figure, another one. She turned just as a second man entered, not as broad, but fast, lean, and dressed in the same grey coat. He saw the wounded man, the blood, the fire, and he pulled a knife. Ruth raised her rifle, but he moved left, quick, out of her shot. He grabbed the boiling kettle and flung it at her. She ducked. Hot liquid sprayed the wall, and when she looked back, he was leaping for the trapdoor. He knew. She ran, got there a breath too late. The trap was open. He was gone, into the tunnel. Ruth turned, locked the loft ladder. "Stay up there!" she barked to the children, then sprinted outside. She circled around the cabin to the rear ridge. The snow had softened just enough to expose movement. One man, fleeing. She followed. The trail twisted through trees, over rocks, across the stream now frozen hard. She didn't care if it was night, didn't care about the cold. He had seen the tunnel. That was her one defense, her one secret, and he had vanished into it. She had to end it. She followed the trail through black pine and drift until it vanished in a ravine. She slid down, rifle high, boots crunching frozen dirt, and then she saw it, a figure ahead, standing still. Not the man, a boy, not the child from her cabin, a different one, barefoot, staring. Behind him, nothing but trees and silence. Ruth's breath caught. Was this a trick? A ghost? The boy turned and ran. Ruth chased, heart pounding, lungs burning, slipping on ice, crashing through brush. And then she saw the cabin lights through the trees. Her cabin. He had led her in a circle, but the door was open, and the fire was dying. She ran faster, too fast. She slipped on a root, slammed her head, and the world went black. The pain was dull at first, distant, like it belonged to someone else. Then it bloomed behind Ruth's eyes like a white-hot ember pressed into her skull. She gasped as the cold slapped her awake, snow crusted into her clothes, rifle still clutched weakly in her right hand. Her cheek was wet where she'd fallen, pressed to the icy ground. Somewhere above, the moon hung behind drifting clouds, indifferent and pale. She sat up slow, her breath hitched. The woods were still, no voice, no scream, no hint of the strange barefoot boy who'd lured her out. Her mind reeled. Had he even been real? Or a trick? Or worse, bait? Ruth's heart turned cold. The cabin. She staggered upright, head spinning, and pushed herself back toward the ridge. Her boots crunched frozen needles, the air sharp with pine and soot. Every branch she brushed sent powder down her collar. She didn't feel it. The cabin's glow came into view fast. A thin pillar of smoke still rose from the twin chimneys, dim against the sky. But something felt wrong. Too dark, too quiet. She crested the ridge and froze. The door was still wide open, and someone had entered. She saw it immediately. Drag marks in the snow, fresh. One set of boots. One heavy body hauled behind, leading to the open door, her own door, the wounded man. She sprinted the last 20 yards, rifle raised, ears straining, no voices, no movement. She slowed at the threshold, knees bent, every muscle wired tight. Inside, warm air, flickering firelight, and blood. A trail of it smeared across the floor, melting into the boards in dark puddles that hissed against the stone hearth. Her rifle trembled in her hands. "Children?" she called softly. No answer. She crossed to the ladder, looked up, empty. The quilts had been tossed. The girl's shawl was on the floor. A doll, one she didn't recognize, lay face down at the top of the rung. She turned toward the trapdoor. It was open. Ruth's breath caught. Then she heard it, a scraping sound, then a whimper. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed a lantern, cracked it to life, and dropped to the floor beside the trap. Her rifle followed. She ducked in. The tunnel below had changed. What had once been her private escape, a tight, claustrophobic trench of packed dirt and timber ribs, had been widened, dug, or clawed. Chunks of the earth were torn out in jagged slices, like something wild had been at work. It sloped downward farther than she remembered. The lantern's glow barely pierced the dark. She crept forward. The scrape sounded again. Closer. She reached the bend and rounded it, and there they were, the girl, shivering and silent, her back against the wall, the boy shielding her with his body, and between them and Ruth, the wounded man. Only he wasn't crawling anymore. He was standing. She almost didn't recognize him. His face was half burned from the boiling water, one eye sealed shut, but the way he stood, ramrod straight, head cocked, was nothing like the collapsed heap she'd left hours earlier. He'd found a knife, a small one, more like a spike, rusted but sharp. "Warmest place in the hills," he said, voice ragged. "And you dug it into the mountain like a mole. Smart." "Step back," Ruth said. "Step away from them. I ain't touching them. Not yet, just thinking." "About what?" He smiled with one half of his face. "About how easy it is to take what you built." He stepped closer to the girl. The boy growled low, not like a child, but like a cornered wolf. Ruth had never heard a sound like that come from a boy so small. "Don't," she warned again. The man looked at her. "You gonna shoot in here? Risk hitting the wall? Bringing this whole place down?" "I'll take the shot. I believe you." He stared at her. "But you won't have another." Then he lunged. Ruth fired. The sound was deafening in the tunnel. The recoil slammed her shoulder into the earth wall. The lantern clattered, dimmed, but stayed lit. The man hit the ground before he reached them. Blood poured from his chest, but he was still breathing, still alive. Ruth didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, pulled the lantern near, and grabbed the spike from his hand. He twitched. "You should have stayed dead," she muttered. He didn't reply. She turned to the children. The boys stared at her, eyes wide. The girl sobbed silently, her fingers locked tight around the doll. Ruth dropped to her knees. "It's over," she whispered. "You're safe." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. She had questions, so many. Why had he returned? Why had he come back through the tunnel? And more importantly, how had he known it was there in the first place? She thought back. The second man, the one who'd vanished into the woods. Had they known each other? Had this been a plan? She needed answers, but first she needed to get them out. Back up top, she sealed the trapdoor and shoved her iron stove against it. That would hold for now. The children were pale and shaking, but unharmed. She gave them warm milk, wrapped them in quilts, and told them to sleep. She sat by the fire until dawn, and when the first light came through the frost-rimmed window, she stood. She was going back down, not to ask, to finish it. But when she opened the trap again, he was gone. Blood trail, empty tunnel, no body, and one word, scratched into the dirt with a shaky hand. "Mine." Ruth stared at the word scratched into the earth, her lantern casting its pale flicker down the tunnel's spine. One word, "mine." Uneven, scrawled with a trembling hand, like it had been dug with a fingernail or the tip of a bloodied stone. The wounded man's blood trail led deeper, smeared against the tunnel wall where he must have braced himself. But no body, no breath, no sound, only cold earth and a growing, gnawing dread. She knelt beside the scratch and ran her hand over it. The dirt was still soft, minutes old, which meant he was close. But more than that, it meant he hadn't come for shelter, or warmth, or food. This hadn't been random. It had been about the cabin. The design, the fireplace, the heat, the idea of it. He wanted to take it, own it, like every other man who'd passed through these mountains with calloused hands and the empty confidence of conquest. And he was willing to die for it. She stood and moved carefully down the tunnel, rifle aimed forward, ears straining for sound. Every creak of timber, every flake of falling dust made her grip tighten. The tunnel sloped further now than she remembered ever digging. That was the strange part. The man hadn't just crawled down it, he'd opened it further. But how? With what strength? 10 paces on, she saw the marks, scratches in the dirt, on the ceiling, the walls, four-fingered, deep, as if someone or something had been digging for days, not hours. And that's when she saw the second word, carved farther on the wall. Hours. Ruth backed up a step, heart racing. This wasn't just madness, it was a claim, the same way men had once marked trees to stake a mining claim or carved initials into canyon stone. But this wasn't stone. It was her tunnel, her earth, her escape. She'd carved it with her own hands. She knew every inch of it, and now it felt foreign, unfamiliar, occupied. She turned to leave, but heard it. Breath, low, ragged, behind her. She spun, and there he was, the man, or what was left of him. He was crawling, not like a wounded man, but like something driven by something deeper. His eyes were bloodshot, feral. His chest heaved. He was dragging himself toward her on one arm, the other pressed to his stomach where the bullet had torn through. But he wasn't moaning. He wasn't pleading. He was smiling. "You thought this place was yours," he rasped. "But it belongs to men like me, builders, claimers." He laughed, a terrible dry sound that echoed off the narrow tunnel. "We were always going to find you." She didn't speak, just raised the rifle. Click, empty. He saw it, grinned wider. "I bled for this," he gasped. "That makes it mine." He surged forward. Ruth dropped the gun, grabbed the lantern, and smashed it against the tunnel wall. The flame caught the oil instantly. Fire erupted in a line across the earth between them, roaring up the walls of the tight passage. The man screamed, pulled back, but the fire caught his coat, then his arm, then his face. She didn't wait to watch him burn. She turned and ran. Smoke chased her up the tunnel, thick and choking. Her lungs burned. She climbed hand over foot, gasping, every muscle screaming. Behind her the fire roared. The timbers popped. She reached the trapdoor just as the heat hit like a slap. The children had already woken. She heard them screaming above. She shoved the stove aside with a strength she didn't know she had, heaved the trap shut, and rolled across the floor, coughing smoke, her hair singed at the edges. The fire raged below, but it didn't spread. The stone hearths held, the cabin held, and when she looked at the children, both alive, both clinging to each other under the quilts, she let herself collapse finally into silence. Later that day, the snow eased. Ruth stepped outside for the first time in 3 days. The air was crisp. The sun glinted off the white hills. No sign of visitors, no more footprints, just smoke curling steadily from both chimneys. Word spread fast passed in the weeks that followed. The man who'd vanished, the children she'd saved, the fire that never spread, and the widow's cabin, warm as summer, even through the worst freeze of the year. Some called it witchcraft, others called it genius, but no one laughed anymore. Not when they came begging for her design, for help, for stone lessons, for the trick of a double fireplace that only needed one fire. She didn't share it with all of them, only some, the ones with children, the ones who never mocked her. And when spring came, and a new family moved in up the ridge, a woman and 2 babies, abandoned by their own, Ruth helped them stack their hearths. She gave them flue dampers forged from old iron, and she showed them the pattern Silas had drawn on a burnt floorboard all those months ago. "You build it this way," she told them, "and it'll hold." It held for me. They asked her why it mattered, why she helped, and she said simply, because every fire should be enough to warm more than one soul. They came in 2s and 3s, the first ones hesitantly, all of them bundled in coats too thin for the wind. Their boots worn through at the heel, faces raw with cold and pride alike. They didn't knock. Most of them just stood at the edge of the clearing, waiting, watching the smoke from both chimneys rise straight into the still blue sky, waiting to be seen. Ruth didn't go to them, not at first. She waited, watched, and then, when they stepped no closer, when the weight of hunger or humility or hope got too heavy for them to bear alone, she opened the door. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Sometimes it was a mother with a sick child on her hip, red-faced and coughing in the wind. Sometimes it was a man who'd burned through every log he'd stacked in the fall, shoulders slumped, pride buckling under frost. Once it was a pair of boys no older than 12, wrapped in horse blankets and carrying a sack of beans and the offer of a morning's labor in trade for 2 nights of warmth. She took them all in, but she never let them pass the main room. The tunnel stayed sealed, and the rifle stayed near. The children, Sarah and Elias, she'd learned, stayed close to her side. Sarah rarely spoke still, but her cough was gone. She'd taken to carving shapes from bits of firewood and hiding them under the mattress. Elias, older and quieter now, watched everything. He helped Ruth tend the fire, learn to split wood, to bank the coals at night, to read the shift in wind by the sound of the chimney's breath. He never left the cabin alone, neither did Ruth. The snow softened as spring teased the edge of the ridge, but the valley below was still locked in frost. Rumors crept upward like vines, slow, insistent, twisting through the mountain paths, that the widow had survived the storm when others hadn't, that she'd taken in orphans, defeated intruders, that her cabin stayed warm on one fire, that her chimney was magic, that her husband had been an inventor, or a witch's son, or a ghost who'd died laying the stones and haunted them still. The truth was less clean. Ruth knew what had happened, what she'd done, what she'd survived. She didn't need the stories to explain it, but they came anyway. One day in mid-March, as the creek began to melt and the trees shed their first coats of snow, a wagon came up the ridge, heavy, slow, pulled by 2 mules and driven by a woman with hands as cracked as Ruth's own. Behind her, 6 children rode inside, all wrapped in burlap and quiet-eyed. The woman stepped down, didn't ask permission to approach. She came right to the porch and looked Ruth square in the face. "I heard what you built." Ruth waited. "I've got stone. I've got hands. I've got 2 weeks before the baby comes, and I can't put another child through another winter in that box we've been calling shelter." Ruth nodded. "You came to learn? I came to build." The 2 women stood in silence, wind tugging at their skirts. Then Ruth stepped back and opened the door. It took 6 days to teach her. Not just the flue design, not just the chimney draft, not just the way the center hearth fed both mouths of stone without choking. Ruth showed her how to stack with care, how to feel for a drawer with a matchstick, how to seal with mud and patience and prayer. "You don't fight the cold," she told her. "You give it nowhere to settle." More came after that. The widow from the hollow below who'd buried 2 sons in the last frost, the blacksmith's niece with hands like iron, a Cherokee matron from over the eastern ridge who brought blue cornmeal and sharp questions, a former teacher, a horse thief, a preacher's daughter, who'd burned her church floor trying to warm 20 orphans at once. They came and Ruth taught them all, not just how to build a double fireplace, how to survive, how to trust the earth more than the sky, how to burn only what you must, how to carve warmth into stone and keep it alive. That summer, 9 new cabins were raised with split chimneys and center hearths, each one warmed by a single fire that fed both lungs of stone. When winter returned, none of them froze, not one, but Ruth didn't go down to see them. She stayed on her ridge. She kept the cabin quiet. The tunnel, She never reopened, not even when curiosity pressed. Sometimes she'd dream of it, hear the scraping again, see the scrawl of hours in her mind, the blood, the man's ragged smile, the boy's ghost-white feet in the snow. Sometimes she'd wake to silence so complete it made her heart pound. And other times, rare but not gone, she'd wake in the night and feel warmth coming from the floorboards. Not heat, not fire, something older. And she'd remember what Silas once said, long before they came to the mountains. "Stone remembers," he told her. "Heat it long enough and it'll keep a secret for you, long after you're gone." She hadn't known what he meant then. She did now. By late summer, Elias had built a second flue by hand. Ruth let him. Sarah began speaking again, her voice faint, bird-like. She asked once if they'd stay through next winter, or the one after. Ruth didn't answer. She just sat by the fire, twin chimneys exhaling smoke like a heartbeat, and watched the shadows play on the stone. One night as the sun died behind the hills, Elias asked, "Is it true that a single fire can warm a whole house?" Ruth looked down at the hearth, then up at the walls, at the faces of two children asleep beside it, and she said quietly, "No. Not unless it's built right." He nodded, not fully understanding. But one day he would, when he built his own, when the winters came harder, when laughter turned again to hunger, and warmth meant life. He'd remember, and he'd know the truth, that it wasn't the double fireplace that saved them. It was the hands that built it, and the will that kept it burning.